So you want to know a little bit more about the Nosferatu in EVE Online? Well, I'm here to explain it because I just went through a little bit of a testing phase to figure out how this thing actually functions. So why would you need a Nosferatu? Well, you can use it to destabilize your enemy's capacitor, or you could use it to try to stabilize your own. In either case, the module has a notation here that says a Nosferatu module will not drain your target's capacitor below your own capacitor level. So this is actually pretty important. This function is not of a percentage. So it says my capacitor is sustainable at 89.1% here on this Raven. But it also states that I have a capacitor of 6,875 gigajoules. That's the important number, not the percentage. So, if we take a look at another ship. Okay, so this is the Stratios. It has a capacitor capacity of 1,360. This capacitor is much smaller than the Ravens. And because that it's smaller, it will almost always take capacitor from the Raven unless the Raven is almost completely out of capacitor. The difference is just absolutely astronomical in terms of how much different these two capacitors are. So if you're looking to make the Raven or any other battleship use a Nosferatu, and you're expecting it to calculate off of percentages, then you're going to be sadly mistaken, because the only time this Raven will ever take any capacitor from that Stratios is when it's almost completely dead. So that brings us to some components that will actually change how big your capacitor is, and therefore how effective your Nosferatu can and should be. So the first component that I would like to take a look at is actually the micro warp drive. It's a very commonly used propulsion system, and the really cool thing about this is that in this particular instance, it's going to reduce our capacitor total. So if I go ahead and just turn this offline, we went from 13 to 1700 gigajoules. Another component that does this exact same thing are your flux coils for your capacitors, or your shield flux coils if you're running a shield fit. This will reduce the maximum capacitor storage. So if we turn that off, we jump up again to 2,125. The reason this is important is because the Nosferatu is based on how big this number is. So if you run these two things together, some kind of micro warp drive and some kind of capacitor flux coil, the chances of another cruiser-sized vessel having more capacitor than you is actually pretty good. 1,360 is a really low number for most cruisers. But by the same token, you can absolutely increase this number inadvertently. So if you're not using, say, something like a capacitor recharger, and instead using something like a cap battery, then your cap will go up. You'll have a larger number, and you'll have a harder time using your Nosferatu. So it's not a really great idea to make your capacitor larger if you're trying to make your Nosferatu even remotely effective. Okay, now that I've got this set up a little bit, I can show you exactly what I mean by percentages versus actual physical numbers or numerical um, sizes here. So I've got the Stratios pulling off of the Raven here, and it's pulling a pretty consistent 36 gigajoules, which is to be expected because this capacitor is only 1,360. However, the Raven, and this is altered a little bit. I ran some of these components in order to bring it down a little bit. The Raven's not pulling anything. It's pulling zero, even though he's at 64% and the Stratios is at 100%. So technically the Raven has a lower percentage of capacitor than the Stratios. And the Stratios is pulling capacitor off of the Raven because its numerical number, 4,500 and change, is larger than 1,360. And it will always be that much larger until I start running a lot more stuff in order to get him to come down in capacitor. This is probably the first cycle we're actually going to see an increase. Yep. So there we took 120, but that just barely dented my capacitor on the Stratios. So as you can see, the capacitor percentages don't mean anything if the actual numerical value is larger. So this is not actually going to stabilize the Raven. The Raven will continue to just lose capacitor, especially if I keep trying to run my ancillary shield booster. But this is one of my favorite Ravens. It's what I like to call an application Raven. If we just pit these guys up against each other right quick, I can show you just how badly this Stratios has against this Raven. So this Raven's completely out of capacitor, and we're just going to sit here and we're just going to decimate it. Yeah, I can't even. So yeah, that's a win. There's no way to keep up with that kind of pressure. And I'll go into that a little bit later in one of my next videos. I want to talk about missiles and application and stuff, and I think that'd be really interesting to see. But anyway, that's how Nosferatus actually work. I looked all over the internet and I couldn't find that information. The differences between percentages and actual volume or capacity. So I'm happy to clear that one up and put it away in the history books for good. I know it's a little bit more basic than what I'm used to posting, but this is one of those basic things that I couldn't find any answers to, so decided to make a video on. Well, thanks for stopping by.